I'm Catherine Wilhelm, Executive Director of the U.S. Asia Law Institute at NYU Law School, and this is our weekly speaker program. Today's talk features another University of Hong Kong legal star, Angela Zhang, also talking about a new book, which is called Chinese Antitrust Exceptionalism: How the Rise of China Challenges Global Regulation. In addition to speaking with us today, Professor Zhang has written a short essay for our USALI Perspectives essay series, which you can find on our website, and we will post the link to her essay in the chat panel. It's going to be related to what she speaks about today. Now, we are truly fortunate to have NYU's own Professor Eleanor Fox, who is one of the country's leading authorities on antitrust, to moderate today's program. Professor Fox is the Walter J. Derenberg Professor of Trade Regulation at NYU Law School. She's worked on antitrust in government and in private practice. She was a partner at Simpson Thacher, a member of the International Competition Policy Advisory Committee at the Department of Justice under President Clinton, and a commissioner on President Carter's National Commission on the Review of Antitrust Laws and Procedures, and she's advised many other jurisdictions, younger antitrust jurisdictions, including South Africa, Kenya, Egypt, Indonesia, Russia, Poland, Hungary, and the Common Market on antitrust. So that comparative lens, of course, will be brought into play today. One last point before I hand the mic to Professor Fox. I'll just mention that in our webinars, we use the Q&A panel for submitting questions, not the chat panel. So please, as you listen today and start to think about your questions, please put them in that space. So with that, Professor Fox, I hand the mic to you.
Thank you very much, Catherine, and hello, everyone. Welcome to this seminar, and especially welcome to you, Angela Zhang. We're really, really happy that you are here today. So let me just tell you all a few words about Angela Huyu Zhang's wonderful credentials to speak to us today. And then I'm going to hand it over to Angela for a presentation. After Angela makes a relatively short presentation, and maybe I'll ask you, Catherine, to make a couple of comments, and then we will want your questions. So we'll be looking for your questions in the Q&A, and I hope to make this very interactive. Angela is truly multicultural. She is from China. She got her first law degree at Peking University. She then got her master's and her doctorate degree at the University of Chicago Law School. She practiced law for 5 years at a few international law firms, New York, London, and Brussels. And then she joined academia, first at King's College London, and then where she is now at University of Hong Kong Law School, where she is Associate Professor and Director of the Center for Chinese Law. Angela is a real star in the international competition law community. And I must say, for those of you who might not have antitrust as your first specialty, she's much broader than that. And she has in her book and generally put her work into a political economy context, which is so important, especially with China. I think you will find when you read her book that she really does have insight into the special workings of China and its regulation and how it regulates, and as compared with United States and European Union. So I am going to hand it over to you, Angela. Thanks for coming so much, and we look forward to your presentation and comments.
Thank you very much, Eleanor, for your incredibly generous introduction. It is a huge honor for me to speak here, and especially a huge honor for me that you are moderating today's book talk for me. You know how grateful I am to you when I reached out to you last summer to write a blurb for my book, and you very generously agree and wrote me a very glowing review of this book, which I placed at the center of the back cover. And all these years, I mean, I'm also very grateful for the support and the generous comment that you gave on my work. And I still regard myself as a very young scholar. I mean, I'm not young anymore. I practiced for a long time compared to other professors maybe. But in academia, I still regard myself as a really young generation. So I am incredibly grateful for all the support that you have for me. So I prepared some slides for today's talk, and let me share my screen. So you see it okay, yeah? So my book, Chinese Antitrust Exceptionalism, deals with how China regulates as an antitrust regulator, as well as how China is regulated as a target for regulation. And when I say China is exceptional, means that because of China's unique political and economic institutions, this results in very strong power imbalances between businesses and government in China. Now, this has implication on how both China regulates and is regulated. Now, for instance, unlike other major antitrust jurisdictions like the EU and the United States, businesses rarely challenge the Chinese antitrust authority. Now, as a result, the entire administrative process is more or less internalized within the bureaucracy. And this makes it very important for us to understand the dynamics of bureaucratic politics in China. Now, this power imbalances between businesses and government also make China a very unique target for regulation, because foreign policymakers often have a very difficult time disentangling the relationship between businesses and the state. And this makes it very difficult for them to determine what exactly is the scope of the Chinese companies. Are they individual companies, or were they just part of a greater China Inc.? So the difficulty to answer this very basic question of scope make Chinese company very vulnerable to antitrust challenges in foreign countries. And in the next 15 minutes or so, I want to do this book talk very differently from other book talk. I will only speak for 15 minutes for the slides, and I will apply this analytical framework of this book to explain the most recent regulatory events involving Alibaba and other big tech firms. So actually, I'm not going to draw the examples from the book. I'm going to talk about the most recent events. And I also hope to offer some insights into the future U.S.-China relations. Now, so how does China regulate? Now, less than 2 weeks ago, Alibaba received a record fine of $2.8 billion from the Chinese antitrust regulator. Now, guess how Alibaba responded here, right? I mean, they thank the regulators. Now, as you see in the press release announced by the firm accepted the penalty with sincerity and will ensure its compliance with determination. Now, contrast this with Google, which has been slapped with 3 fines from the commission. And you can see from the press release that Google was prepared to fight tooth and nail with the commission in Luxembourg court, right? So why are companies reluctant to challenge China's antitrust enforcement? Now, I mean, I saw there's a lot of China experts that signed into today's talk. So you would think, yeah, of course. I mean, this is very intuitive. You know, businesses in China need to maintain a very good relationship with the government. And especially if they need to repeatedly interact with the government, right? I mean, so if you sue them, then it's like burning bridge with the government. But what you may not know is that the Chinese antitrust authorities are very good at using media strategies to entice firms to cooperate and settle. And this is what I call the strategic shaming strategy. And I want to emphasize the word strategic here because they don't uniformly apply this strategy to all the firms. They only apply that occasionally to entice firms to cooperate. So on Christmas Eve last year, the Chinese antitrust regulator posted a very short one-sentence announcement in Chinese that it had launched an investigation into Alibaba's business practice. Now, only 10 minutes later, after this announcement, the People's Daily published a very long commentary endorsing this investigation. And this move was probably prepared in advance, right? I mean, the commentary appears designed to seek the first mover advantage and to shape the rhetoric of the discussion of the case. Now, this one sentence announcement caused Alibaba's stock prices to tumble. And on that day, we observed that Alibaba's stock prices dropped by more than 13%, wiping out over $100 billion market capitalization, okay? Now, there's nothing particularly wrong with a government agency announcing the investigation on its website, but we should also be aware that this is actually the first time this antitrust authority has ever done that, right? I mean, in the past, it has kept a very low profile in investigating cases precisely for fear of damaging the firm's stock prices. You know, even when they investigate Tencent, you know, back in 2019, they didn't make any announcement on its website. And the timing of the announcement was also very strategically planned in advance with the holiday break, because they announced it on Christmas Eve, right? I mean, so it's the holiday break gave the agency the room to moderate the market sanction if it, you know, if the announcement turned out to be too harsh. And this need to moderate the market might also explain why on December the 27th, you saw the government release positive news, because that was a Sunday before the next trading day, that it had completed gathering evidence in Hangzhou, which is Alibaba's headquarters, and the firm was very cooperative during the process. Now, some of you may say, well, if these authorities are rarely challenged in court, then they should be free to do whatever they want, right? I mean, so this might, you know, I have read commentaries recently say, you know, how, you know, American authorities might be jealous of what China can achieve in such a short span of time. But that's actually not true, right? I mean, these authorities actually are subject to severe bureaucratic constraints. And as one official told me, we can only dance within the boundaries of our prescribed stage. And what he was talking about was referring to this phenomenon of power fragmentation in the Chinese bureaucracy, which impose significant constraints on any one agency's freedom of action. So each government department in China have their own responsibility and objectives, and that define their scope of action. But at the same time, because they often have overlapping responsibility, this inevitably will give rise to turmoil and interagency rivalry. And that's what I call the Chinese style of checks and balance, right? I mean, it's kind of like a substitute for the Western style of the checks and balance in the Chinese context. Now, Chinese antitrust enforcement is actually a very good example of this. In the first decade of the enforcement, the power to enforce the law was split among three different agencies. You have the NDRC and SAIC, which were jointly in charge of conducting investigations. And then you have the Ministry of Commerce in charge with merger enforcement. Now, the different missions, cultures, and the structure of these agencies heavily influence how they formulate the enforcement agenda, their regulatory approach, as well as the final regulatory outcome. Now, some of you may have read in the news that recently the Chinese Antitrust Authority held an administrative guidance meeting with major Chinese tech firms. And at the meeting, 34 firms preemptively offer to ratify their exclusionary conduct, such as the choose one from two practice that Alibaba was investigated for. Now, if you take a look at this kind of commitment offered by the firms, you will notice that they were so broad that they went far beyond antitrust law. Now, here I show you a press announcement from JD.com, which is also an e-retailer. And its compliance letter emphasized adherence to consumer protection law, e-commerce law, anti-monopoly law, advertising law, price law, all of which are within the enforcement mandates of the SAMR, which is the current antitrust authority. So it appears that the antitrust authority, it appears to me that what it is doing now is trying to leverage its antitrust function to strengthen its own enforcement in many other areas of market regulation. So this development actually reinforced my point about how the mission, the culture, and the structure of an enforcement agency actually really matters for the final enforcement outcome. Now, I want to shift my focus to the international arena and examine how China weaponizes antitrust law in the Sino-US tag war. We should start by noting that the US executive branch has very wide discretion in prosecuting foreign businesses and individuals, and has strategically used this discretion as an instrument of trade and foreign policy against China. And then this is quite clear in cases involving Huawei and ZTE. And these cases were sort of like a wake-up call for the Chinese policymakers who was scrambling to identify what kind of policy tools do we have to counter the US long-arm jurisdiction. And then they quickly identify antitrust as an appealing weapon to use against the US. This is primarily because antitrust allows the Chinese government to exert extraterritorial jurisdiction over US business practice, as long as those companies have sufficient sales in the Chinese market, right? I mean, for instance, a large merger transaction between a US company and a European company, which seemingly has nothing to do with China, can be held up by the Chinese merger control. Now, Qualcomm's acquisition of NXP and that deal in 2018 was one such an example, right? I mean, the deal obtained clearance from 8 jurisdictions, and China was the only one that held up this deal. Now, I should note that China didn't block this deal, but strategically delayed its approval to such an extent that the party ultimately withdrew the transaction. Now, Cisco's acquisition of Acacia, which is a deal very recently occurred, was similarly delayed for a really long time, and Cisco actually ended up paying a much higher price for Acacia because of the delay. And just last month, Applied Material, which is a top US chip making a supplier, had to walk away from its proposed deal to acquire Japanese electric companies, again, because of the approval delayed. Now, in addition to holding up large mergers, the Chinese Antitrust Authority has also flexed antitrust as a weapon to investigate foreign firms, as you can see from this news article from the Global Times, that they can launch an investigation into companies like Qualcomm, Cisco, and Apple under the antitrust law. So as Sino-US tensions intensify, the Chinese antitrust may well become the battleground for trade and national security issues. Now, after examining how China regulates, let's examine how China itself has been regulated by foreign authorities. We will start by examining the antitrust legal challenges that Chinese companies face in Europe. Now, in 2016, EDF, which is a French state-owned firm, and CGN, which is a Chinese nuclear state-owned firm, wanted to create a joint venture in the UK, as I show you in the picture here. It's a Hinkley Point. And the commission decided in that case, for the first time, that it would actually treat all the Chinese companies in the energy sector as one single entity. And this has huge ramifications under the EU antitrust law. I mean, but ironically, it also put the commission in a dilemma, because the commission may risk jeopardizing its own jurisdiction over mergers or cartels among Chinese state-owned firms. Because if the commission see all Chinese firms as a large China Inc., then they should have no authority over cases involving 2 or more Chinese firms, because these will be kind of like deals within a company, right? Now, this explains why the EU is increasingly looking for alternative regulatory tools to deal with Chinese investment. And its most ambitious proposal came last year when the Commission released a white paper which proposed a new merger control regime to wet state-backed acquisitions. And many observers believe that this move is specially targeted at Chinese firms. And this potentially can give the Commission tremendous leverage in holding up transactions involving Chinese companies. Now, even when the Chinese firms were facing regulatory problems in Europe, they the Chinese exporters are also facing challenges from the United States. The most famous case involved a group of vitamin C producers, and this case involved a group like an export cartel, and the case went all the way up to the U.S. Supreme Court. Now, these producers did not deny that they had coordinated prices, but they defended themselves on the basis of foreign sovereign immunity, arguing that it was the Chinese government that have coerced them to fix prices. Now, the Chinese Minister of Commerce also submitted a amicus brief acknowledging this compulsion, but in the end, the Supreme Court decided it is not bound by the Chinese government's interpretation of its own law. Right? I mean, so, and instead, the Supreme Court deferred to the U.S. executive branch on how to handle this case. So the outcome of this case, I mean, actually, I think places the Chinese exporters in a catch-22 situation because of the excess supply in China. I mean, the overcapacity problem in China, inevitably, if they compete fiercely, the prices will be very low, and then they could be subject to anti-dumping charges. But on the other hand, if they coordinate in advance and raise prices, they will be subject to antitrust liabilities. So this situation put the Chinese exporters in quite a precarious situation. Now, finally, I would like to draw some insights on the U.S. China relations. Now, for a really long time, people have been asking this question: is China a friend or a foe? And given what have been happening the past few years, maybe more and more of you in the West have decided that China is no longer a friend. But the reality remains that the Chinese and the US economies are tightly integrated, and there are mutual benefits for cooperation, and in many areas, right? I mean, including most recently climate change. So the question becomes, in the absence of trust and friendship, is there any hope for cooperation? And I hope this book tells you yes. You see, even though foreign firms are vulnerable to regulatory attacks from Chinese regulators, Chinese firms are equally vulnerable to attacks from foreign regulators. And we are seeing this tightened scrutiny over Chinese firms from both the US and the EU regulators, not just in antitrust, but also in trade and foreign investment. So the fact that both sides can obtain significant leverage over each other is a good thing, right? I mean, because it is a kind of hostage exchange that is essential to maintaining peace between the two countries. And that's precisely why I think it's important for both sides to facilitate more integration rather than less. For instance, if Chinese companies like Huawei, WeChat and TikTok, I mean, these companies are blocked from the US market, then the United States in the future will have less leverage over China. And that will actually make the US operation, think about Qualcomm, think about Cisco, think about Tesla, will make these operations in China more vulnerable. And I would like to pause here, and we'll look forward to the discussion with Professor Fox and the rest of the audience here.
So thank you, Angela. That was wonderful. We're all very excited to read your book, which is sort of the underpinnings for what are the current events. So Angela, you've given us a really beautiful lay of the land and run through of how China regulates and its strategic shaming and the bureaucratic constraints, and the fact that within China there's much more diversity of agencies than many would think and expect, that there's not just one China Inc. And then you also gave us a wonderful view of how China is regulated and how the Chinese firms have to be very aware of and beware of European Union and US regulation. And you've ended on a really wonderful, hopeful note of we can have more harmony between the three jurisdictions and the world. So if you permit me, I would like to give a few comments sort of from inside antitrust, rather than beginning with China, and say something about how the US and EU and world antitrust communities see China's relationship to the whole global picture of competition law. So just to back up and to be really basic first, for those of you who are not competition lawyers, competition law, which is also called antitrust, mainly has jurisdiction in three fields. One is agreements, and usually this is price fixing, like Angela was mentioning, the Chinese companies' agreement to fix export prices into the United States. That's very typical agreement that's typically illegal. Secondly, monopoly and dominant firms. And Angela mentioned big tech and what's been happening now with China's crackdown on Alibaba and other tech firms. Are the tech firms using their dominant power to squeeze out competition? This is really interesting, and so interesting for the international community to watch China cracking down on tech firms, where the firms outside of China are so scared that China is going to be the one who takes over the world on tech, and might have been thinking that China wouldn't be cracking down on its own firms, but be aggressive, taking over the world. And then the third is mergers, big mergers. So China has been a big player in antitrust in all three of these areas with its own enforcement of its own competition law. It developed a modern competition law, which went into effect in 2008, and it immediately became a big player in the world of competition law and international competition law. So much so now that every big merger transaction, the parties know getting China's approval is one of the necessary elements of getting a big multinational merger through. So one thing really interesting about China and competition law is that I'd say for 98% of the time, and Angela, you can check me if this is right, China plays by more or less what is called international standards. There is an antitrust community that develops more or less, they vary, but more or less, the rules of the game, like what is an anti-competitive merger. And China has fit into this picture, playing by the rules, except on few occasions when it decides the rules aren't good for it or some other rules better for it, and it kind of reaches in and does something unique. But for the most part, in competition law, I have the feeling that more than other fields, China is considered an international player, and this extreme tension doesn't exist except in rare cases. And Angela, you have given us some of those rare cases. For most of the world, like US and EU, they play by a rule of law. We apply only antitrust to antitrust. We don't use it as a trade chip to start a tit-for-tat trade war and say, well, we could use antitrust as a weapon here, but China does. As you've mentioned, for example, you just mentioned Qualcomm and XMP, where it was definitely a chit. Getting a merger clearance through on antitrust grounds was a chit in the tit-for-tat trade game. So one unique thing about China in its antitrust is the following. There is an international community in antitrust called the International Competition Network. Every nation in the world that has an antitrust law, with a couple of companies just going online, countries, has joined this International Competition Network, except China. And this is where the countries of the world seek to understand one another, and get some kind of convergence. And so far, China has not joined. Taiwan, and the Taiwan is in the network, and China gives Taiwan as one reason why it doesn't want to be part of the international network. But this network is the place for greater coherence moving forward, having a kind of globalization of competition law, even though there's no international competition law, it's national. But this is where you get convergence. So China so far is standing on the outside. The international community would love China to join. The European Union, US, and other countries have very good relations with the Chinese competition authorities and deal with them and have mutual agreements for exchanges of information, and regard them as good colleagues. So the one point where there's a clear opportunity is this international network. And then other than that, the way I think US and EU sees it is China mostly follows the rules, except when it doesn't in this very small area. And Angela, one of your points, which I think US and EU doesn't see at all, is that flip side where China's companies are really concerned about overregulation and being targets by US. That I think you bring to the table a really new perspective, because US and EU are really seeing it only the other way. It is true that both Americans and Europeans are becoming, I think, paranoid, and you also can comment on this, about China, and will want to justify mergers to get through, et cetera, by saying, if we don't merge, China will take over the market. So there's this great fear of China, which might result in some differences in either over enforcement or under enforcement of competition law because we're afraid of China. So I will end my remarks there and would love to hear your comments on a lot of this later. I did want to raise one point though, which I might like your comments, we might like later, is when I talk about US fear of China in the economic arena, a lot of it relates to data and surveillance. And this issue for both US and EU, it supervenes antitrust and it goes over to national security. And most nations do have their separate national security vehicle, like US has CFIUS, where we can veto mergers that will threaten international security. That has a distinct relationship with antitrust, for example, whether mergers are let through, whether companies are let to do business in the United States. US has this serious fear that if, for example, we let Huawei take a big merger, make a big merger in the United States and be in the United States, it will be swooping up the data on everyone and use it against us. I don't know if there's anything like a counter fear in China, but that is a cloud hovering over us. So my antitrust theory is it's actually a very harmonious one with China, with these exceptions at the peripheries. So I'll end the antitrust part there. And Catherine, you have so much experience with China and in China, having lived there for so long. And I wonder if you will say a few words too. And then after you say a few words, Angela, would you like to take up some of the issues? And then we're getting some questions on the Q&A. And we already have some wonderful questions, and we want to get to the questions as soon as possible too. So I'm thinking even before Angela responds, I'll get to the questions. Catherine, say a few words. I'll get to some of the questions, And then Angela, you can respond when you answer the questions, okay? And thank you. And over to you, Catherine, if you'll say a few words.
Okay. Well, thank you very much for giving me the opportunity, because this has been a fascinating conversation. I really enjoyed Angela's initial presentation, and just now what you said was extremely useful in positioning this in the global antitrust picture. I'd just like to say I'm not an antitrust person, so I can't come at it from that perspective. But just as somebody who has followed Chinese law, what was striking to me in reading some of what Angela's written in the past and hearing her remarks today, what is striking to me is how much of what she says about antitrust regulation fits in with what we often say and hear about regulation generally in China, across in other fields as well. So in so many areas of law, completely unrelated to antitrust or not even in the corporate sphere, you'll hear the comment that oh, such and such a law is not a bad law, it's a pretty good law. Enforcement is difficult. Enforcement is a problem. And then you're always wondering, well, why is enforcement a problem? In so many different areas of law, it's a problem. And I know that Angela has highlighted in some of her writings the issue of that the enforcement staffs are small, so they don't have a lot of people to work with compared to, say, the US or EU staffs. But the enforcement problems that they face because of the bureaucratic limitations that you mentioned, Angela, because of this turf wars, because of their sense of being hemmed in, kind of pushes them in the direction of taking these measures that we would consider unusual for an enforcer, which basically comes down to a kind of bullying behavior where you're taking the law and bludgeoning your regulatory objects over the head with it, which we do see in other areas of law as well. The idea of using one law that, ostensibly on paper is designed at certain things, antitrust, we're thinking about correcting for market failure, enabling markets to operate more efficiently. And yet we have seen it time and again used in some contexts, as just now mentioned, in trade war tit for tat, but also to prevent foreign companies from taking over national brands, or as you're emphasizing today with the Alibaba example, using it to perhaps push companies in other directions in the tech sphere, areas where you discuss in your essay that we published at USALI Perspectives, encouraging the tech companies to invest more in basic technology development, using the law for purposes that are not really part of the original intent of the law. And all of this goes to what I think, when we look at Chinese legal system broadly, makes us raise the question mark about, does China have rule of law? If enforcement is campaign style enforcement, if it is not predictable, if it is not routine, if companies are never quite sure whether it's okay today but not okay tomorrow, if they're suddenly shamed, if they're basically bullied, as you describe it, being called into a sort of group, a shaming meeting, and competing with each other to say, I will lower my prices even more than the guy next to me lowered his prices. So if enforcement is unpredictable, and if the law is being used to achieve other goals outside of the predicted scope of the law, what kind of rule of law do we have here? And then the only other thing I want to observe is then it raises a question in my mind, again, not as an antitrust expert, of how effective this is as a tool of antitrust enforcement. In other words, if you are using these methods of enforcement, does it actually work to achieve what are the presumed intents of antitrust? Does it actually help to prevent monopolies? Does it actually help to encourage competition, healthy competition? Does it actually protect consumer interests or not? Is it working? Is it fit for purpose? Is it working as intended originally? And also, I wonder, does it work in the way that you have said in your essay in particular to achieve these other goals? So is this attack on Alibaba going to actually encourage Alibaba to do more basic tech investment? Would it be more effective to use other kinds of approaches, like maybe tax incentives or other kinds of collaboration with a company. We know, for example, or we've been told, we've heard, I don't personally know, that Huawei has been given access to government databases of images, like the national ID databases, to enhance their AI facial recognition capacities. Well, that is definitely a way that a government can assist a player to be a competitor on the world stage. So that's an affirmative way of assisting them. And I'm wondering whether bludgeoning them with antitrust will actually be effective in encouraging China's tech giants to somehow compete in the areas where the government may think they're insufficiently competing. So I'll stop there, but thank you. This has been really so informative.
Okay, thank you. I mean, those are great questions. May I do this because I want to get to the questions, the Q&As. Angela, could you make a note of the questions you would like to answer, including those questions that Catherine just posed? But I want to come to the questioners, the Q&As first, and we're going to give you time, obviously, before the end to answer. But we have on our queue some wonderful people and wonderful questions, and I'm going to go to that next. And Jerry Cohen, hello Jerry, nice of you to come and ask this question. Jerry asks, what policies would you suggest to Biden for improving government regulation of business with China?
So should I answer the question now? Yeah,
I realize this is a little staccato because we've had wonderful questions from Catherine, which I'm putting on hold. You had some questions from me, I'm putting on hold. I'm going to the Q&A so I don't ignore it. And then
okay,
I'm going to ask you, yes. Would you address Jerry Cohen's question?
Sure. I know there's currently, being in Hong Kong, I'm just watching all these debates that have been unfolding in America. And I mean, obviously there is a bipartisan consensus in the United States of taking a very tough approach in dealing with China. And so far, even the Biden administration has not removed any tariffs in China. And so I don't see the Biden administration would drastically soften its approach towards China. And and this kind of tick for tack, we probably would not fundamentally change under the Biden administration. But I guess if the current, leadership is willing, the U.S. leadership is willing to make even a little bit first move of offering some concession to the Chinese government, I think this will definitely facilitate the cooperation of the two sides, because in this rivalry between China and the United States, I mean, the United States obviously have much more leverage over China. But at the same time, the Chinese leadership need to look tough in front of its domestic audience. And that explains this kind of rising nationalism in China. And the Chinese diplomats are, increasingly employing very tough rhetoric against foreign government, including the United States. So I guess if America is willing to extend a small olive branch, the Chinese government is very likely to respond with concessions as well. And that will lead to more of a win-win situation. Otherwise, I see both sides are just engaged in like kind of race or bottom type of regulatory competition. And what worries me most as a legal scholar is like this kind of vicious cycle is actually maybe regressing the Chinese legal reform and make it even more difficult for those progressive intellectuals and policymakers in China to put forward more positive reforms to change China. And also this not only harm Chinese companies, but also foreign companies operating in China. I mean, I gave you an example of how China weaponized its antitrust, during Sino-US tech war. The move by China looks very aggressive, but it actually reflects more of the weakness on the part of China rather than its strength, right? I mean, think about the United States doesn't need to weaponize its antitrust law because the United States have so many cards on its table. But at the end of the day, China doesn't have those things. Right? I mean, the biggest weapon China have is market access, and antitrust law is simply an extension of that. But at the same time, it is a double-edged weapon, and then China is acutely aware of that. I mean, in the best case scenario, China would not need to weaponize this antitrust law, would not need to arbitrarily apply this law to strategically discipline US companies. I don't think China wants to do that. It is a self-destructive move, right? I mean, because this will, cause worry among the foreign investors in China, and may lead to more decoupling, right? I mean, so I guess, in this marriage, America is the dominant figure here. So I think, from a Chinese standpoint, if we see, America make a little bit move towards a positive direction, I'm pretty sure China will move much, much better forward. Yeah.
So thank you, Angela. Jerry, in case you would like to respond, would you like to respond? We could unblock your mic if you would like to. Alexis, could you unblock Jerry's mic? Because I have a feeling that you might have some words of wisdom for us.
I like the answer, but we need more specifics. And I ask it in the context of many of us searching for areas of potential greater cooperation between the US and China. We talk about climate, some progress maybe and be made now. We have other areas where we haven't seen Biden moving on, we're waiting. But it seemed to me here there's enough common interest and enough interest of the business community that we should be conducting dialogues with the Chinese regulatory authorities, especially antitrust, about how better to communicate and perhaps work out with other countries, including Europe and Japan, a common scheme of regulation. We're about to have next week 6 hours of human rights dialogue with Chinese experts. And it's going to be much of a waste of time in the current context. But antitrust discussions with people like Angela and Eleanor taking part, this could be a creative move forward. We have to find ways of enhancing our points of contact and cooperation.
So that is extremely interesting, Jerry. And there is an antitrust dialogue, but it's not at the right level, because our antitrust dialogue is with the antitrust people, and which is pretty low down in the Chinese hierarchy. Somehow it would be great if that could be raised to a higher level, because the antitrust dialogue, antitrust to antitrust, is doing pretty well. But the problem is it's not doing well where we need it, which is exactly that periphery of weaponization, for example. So I'm about to ask a question, or hear Jose Alvarez's question, but Jose, I wondered if you wanted your mic unblocked, if you wanted to add to this conversation, and I'll have Angela add to this conversation. And then Jose, I wanted you to ask your question. If can Jose's mic be unblocked?
Hello? Yes, his mic is unmuted.
Okay, Jose, did you want to intervene?
Yes. Am I still muted?
No, you're okay.
Oh, great. Thanks, Angela, very much. And I just received your book. I haven't yet read it, but I look very much forward to it. Like Jerry, I was asked, I would be curious about a little bit more specifics about if there are specific areas that you see cooperation between the US and China. But I was asking, and I wrote it in the chat box, but I guess Eleanor is suggesting that I just present my questions. So I had 3 questions. Feel free to ignore any of them. My first broad question is, I noticed you dedicated the book to Richard Posner, and I was curious how much you owe to Posner. He's quite a figure in law and economics, and but when somebody dedicates a book, I expect that there's a lot more story behind it. So I am curious at a general level of how much his work has influenced you. including in this book. The second question is about another of your endorsers, which is Anu Bradford, who wrote The Brussels Effect, which I'm sure you know is about the broader normative impact of EU economic regulation. From what you've described, the rather idiosyncratic, untransparent approach China undertakes suggests that we should not expect the Chinese effect, that we should not expect other regulators around the world to imitate in any way what China is doing. But the sheer economic weight of China makes me think that maybe that story is a bit more nuanced. So I'm just curious if you think there is any trace of the Chinese effect and whether that's your next book, for instance. And then I guess finally, I was curious about your extraterritorial discussion. China has been known, at least in the views of somebody like Kanjian Kai, who wrote The Rise of China, as opposing extraterritorial legislation around the world and very critical of when the US, for example, uses extraterritorial jurisdiction to assert and throw its weight around. And yet what you're describing is a rather active extraterritorial use of Chinese law in antitrust. And I'm curious if you think that's unique to antitrust or whether it's really false to claim that China has this limiting approach, as Kanjian Kai says, because I do think that, for example, with respect to the Hong Kong security law, there's clearly a purported extraterritorial effect there too. So I'm just curious what you can say about Chinese approaches to extraterritorial jurisdiction. And again, feel free to ignore any of these between my questions and Catherine questions and Eleanor, you've got your hands full.
Yes, wonderful. As I thank you. Okay, so Angela, why don't you take up the questions from Jose that you would like to answer?
Yeah, I mean, these are wonderful, wonderful questions. Thank you very much. So first of all, this book is dedicated to my advisor, Richard Posner. And for a number of reasons, I remember when, even before I met him, my then boyfriend and now husband actually sent him a copy of his book and asked him to sign that book for me. And then on that book, and he wrote the following. He said, "Bring the rule of law to China." And for that, I forever remember, and that's actually solidified my goal to be an independent scholar. And obviously, when you read the book, I was quite critical of what's happening in China, but I'm also critical of what's happening in Europe and the United States. So I try to be as neutral as possible. I try to take away my preconception of things, but even though that might be hard sometimes. The other most important inspiration I have from Posner is this, because I read so much of his book, and from his book, you really see the very pragmatic style of research, and that greatly influenced how I write this book, because I was an antitrust lawyer, so very naturally, I'm very natural to, it's very natural for me to think about antitrust issues. It's very new to me, all this politics, all this economic, institution issues, all these international relations, all these things are completely new to me as I embark on my research. But I do realize, in order to answer the question that is very important in Chinese antitrust, I need to educate myself with all these questions. So I start, looking at the political science literature, looking at the economics literature, and looking at international relations. And for a long time, I would be kind of regarded as an outlier among antitrust scholars, because I don't really write about, the nitty-gritties of antitrust law. I write about the political economy of antitrust. But I realized to answer that question, that I think it's very important, I do need to incorporate those insights. So like my whole research journey up until now is all driven by questions rather than methodology. I just do the best I can to try to answer the questions before me. And regard to your question about, what kind of China, is there a China effect? I suspect no. I mean, unless it is an authoritarian government. I mean, what you're seeing right now is, especially with the regulation of the big tech, it is very much a top-down driven initiative, which is very different from the first 12 years when China, it's more driven by a bottom-up efforts, but now what we're seeing is part of a law enforcement campaign driven from the top down. And it's as Catherine and Eleanor pointed out, I mean, that like you see the sudden shift of regulatory intensity, and from being very lax at the beginning for the first 12 years to suddenly very strict, right? I mean, the pendulum swings very quickly in this authoritarian model. And so I don't see, the possibility of China exporting this kind of volatile way of regulating, big tech to other countries. But obviously other countries will be looking, especially antitrust authority, they might be looking envily and look at what China have done. But, but at the same time, I mean, this comes with great costs, like as Catherine pointed out. I mean, would this really lead to success? We don't know. I mean, we have to just wait and see, right? I mean, because it looks to me there is simultaneously over enforcement and under enforcement, right? I mean, cases like Alibaba, right? I mean, the firm just like raise their hands and they pay the fine and move on. There's no challenge, right? They thank the regulator. But as to the other tech firms, right? I mean, the agency seems to be saying, if you comply, we're not going to investigate you. And but if you don't, I mean, we can come back to investigate you. And that seems to be under enforcing the law, right? I mean, if they have done something wrong, I mean, what is the basis for this kind of preemptive settlement, right? I mean, so I don't know how effective Beijing will be in disciplining its tech firms and how effective it will in achieving those industrial policy goals that it might want to nudge these companies towards different direction to help China achieve technological self-sufficiency. I mean, all this remains question mark. And I mean, this will be something that I will definitely keep a close eye on in my future research. And as to your last question about the extraterritorial effects, I think it's really since about 2000, I think Professor Cai Chongyang's book, which is a very well received book, it was published a couple of years ago. And I guess when he was writing it, he hasn't observed that trend yet. And this is really very recent. I mean, it was really since 2018, the Trump administration started a slew of very aggressive attack on Chinese companies and Chinese executives. And it's the first time, the Chinese leadership realized, we need to have some kind of countermeasures for this kind of long-arm jurisdiction. So they look around, and see, what laws do we have that allowed us to exert extraterritorial jurisdiction? And you see, antitrust is a perfect example, right? I mean, that's a powerful economic weapon that allow you to hold up big mergers and like Qualcomm and XP, right? I mean, so it is just China is just starting to realize, this kind of the power of extraterritoriality to reach other countries. And then it's starting to look around, not just antitrust, but also export control. And there's other in foreign investment. There's many different areas China is doing that. So that's why I said the United States and China are now currently engaged in a dangerous legal battles, right? I mean, because for a really long time, scholars like Chinese scholars mostly focus on studying what's happening in China. But now there is very obvious trend that what is happening outside of China will have an indirect effect on how China will change its law. And this is a worrying trend, right? I mean, because two countries are engaged in a tick for tack, it seems like they're engaged in the race to the bottom. in that sense. But I think at the same time, China is very cautiously meting out those sanctions on foreign firms precisely because these are kind of self-destructive move. And so in many occasions, you see those, like, for instance, like non-entity lists or the blocking statute that China recently promulgated. I mean, I see them as more bark than bite, right? I mean, China will only bite at the very last resort. So it really depends on how the United States will move. And you know, unless it's really necessary, I mean, China will not try to use those weapons. But I can see China is doing that precisely. I mean, it's kind of trying to create this kind of nuclear power weapon in law, and in trying to deter foreign aggression.
Oh, so thank you. I would like to circle back to Catherine's question and bring it into this conversation. I want to bring it into the possible China effect. Is there a China effect conversation? And when you think of, is there a China effect, one thinks of idiosyncratic industrial policy. It runs against cosmopolitanism, and this is the problem. So I also agree, I don't see a China effect, but if I thought I saw a China effect, it would be a race to the bottom and not a very good one. So here's where Catherine's question comes back in. If China is using its antitrust law to bully in ways that are not antitrust related, doesn't it undermine antitrust as being fit for its purpose? This is what Catherine asked. Is its antitrust being used fit for its purpose? And then I also just want to relate this question to the rest of this big discussion that Jerry raised about, and Jose picked up on too, about if there are going to be concessions on each side, where will be the concessions? Where will we move to get greater harmony and dissipate the tensions? And here I run into exactly the same problem. The China effect is anti-cosmopolitanism. And to have harmony, don't you want the cosmopolitan move? So I would like you to say a few words on that. Maybe you've already said a lot. And just to alert you, Russell Pittman, you've made a couple of really interesting questions and comments. And after that, I'm going to call on you and ask to unblock your mic for you to perhaps ask what you think are the most important questions. So Angela.
Like, I mean, Eleanor, I definitely agree with your observation earlier that, you know, 98% of the Chinese antitrust enforcement is quite normal, right? I mean, you see growing convergence between China and other jurisdictions, right? So for a large extent, you know, if you talk to a practitioner in Beijing, I think for a large extent, looking at EU and the US jurisdictions for guidance and to predict how Chinese authority will react. But there are a small minority of cases that we talk about, right? I mean, where it's driven by law enforcement campaign, or, you know, where China strategically weaponized the antitrust law. And antitrust here, then it is used not for its original purpose as a tool to regulate competition, but for trade and for foreign policy concern. And even before, right? I mean, even when NDRC was an enforcer, I mean, it actively go out to trying to pressure merchants not to raise prices using antitrust law. I mean, that's also used as, you know, a tool for macroeconomic management as well. So I guess from the Chinese standpoint, I mean, this is actually not something very exceptional among Chinese law. I mean, law is used as an instrument to advance all sorts of policy goals in China. And it happens that antitrust deals with competition issues, but it can also conveniently be used to achieve industrial policy objectives or macroeconomic objectives or foreign trade and investment, right? And as to, if there is any concrete step for cooperation, I would definitely think it will be relating to business and particularly technology. And I definitely agree with Professor Cohen's observation, right? I mean, human rights will be highly unlikely to be an area that we can achieve significant progress. And going back to this kind of utility function of an authoritarian government. I mean, they emphasize on economic prosperity, they emphasize on social stability, and lastly, they care about nationalism. And I can see, the bottom lines of the Chinese government is, they're not going to give any concessions on human rights, on Xinjiang or on Hong Kong, because that concern, that's something that they worry about for social stability and also for nationalism purpose. But on the other hand, I definitely think the Chinese government will have clear interests in promoting economic prosperity and can achieve cooperation with the United States and other Western countries on, economic issues. Like, regulation will be a very obvious area that the two sides can, to achieve common ground. And back in a few months ago, when the Trump administration imposed ban on TikTok, I did notice there's some academic debate in the United States. Like, if China is not opening its borders to U.S. tech firms, right? I mean, Google cannot, operate in China without censorship, then it seems legitimate for us to block, TikTok, right? I mean, this is a perfectly tick for tack strategy. But the thing is, like, when we talk about tick for tack, we have to presume that when you extend this threat to the counterparty, there is room for the other side to make concession. But I just don't see there's any possibility for the Chinese government to, remove the censorship requirements on the U.S. tech firms, right? I mean, so you're not seeing any room for negotiation here. So this kind of tick for tack strategy is not going to work. China is not going to, back down because Trump had banned TikTok from entering into American market. And instead, what you see, it will be even more aggressive, response from China and even more nationalistic response from China that the United States is just trying to sabotage all Chinese technology company, right? I mean, being, jealous of China's rights. So, when we think about tick for tack and when we think about all this strategy America could use to counter China, trying to achieve cooperation in China, we need to think about where is the room? What are the areas that potentially both sides can achieve some common grounds and there is room for negotiation, right? I mean, so, and I definitely think antitrust will be one of the area, right? I mean, because China doesn't want to block Qualcomm NXP if United States does not ban all these essential components to Huawei, right? I mean, now China has become the choke point for the semiconductor industry. They block, they strategically withhold all acquisitions in the semiconductor industry because they are worried if the US company buy out, a Japanese or European chip maker, then it will make it even more difficult for the Chinese companies like Huawei to source these essential components, right? I mean, so you can see where the Chinese are coming from, right? I mean, so if US can back down and make a little bit concession and ensuring the supplies to companies like Huawei, right? I mean, or even there's other ways you can ensure this, security issues, then I'm sure China will back down. So I think that's maybe one of the area we can start the negotiation.
Great, thank you. So Russell Pittman, you have several questions and comments. Alexis, could you unblock Russell Pittman's mic? And Russ, could you just ask one or two of the questions or make one or two of the comments as succinctly as possible?
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you, Eleanor. Thank you, Angela, for a very interesting book. It just arrived yesterday, so I'm not quite finished with it yet, but I'm enjoying it. I wanted to shift my discussions are going to focus back on, my questions are going to focus back on domestic Chinese competition law enforcement and the agencies, or I guess maybe agency now itself. And in particular, I was interested in the question near and dear to Eleanor's and my heart, which is competition advocacy. And so among the several topics that occurred to me that one might hope and have seen in other countries the competition agencies take on, one of them would be the local protectionism that you mentioned in the book. Another one might be restructuring of some of the old state monopolies, especially in the natural monopoly area, like railways and electricity. And another one that occurred to me, and this is probably one where you can tell me they just won't have the power, but maybe it's possible. You know, in Europe, the competition agencies fight state aids. And, you know, in my experience as a US enforcer, speaking very unofficially, of course, boy, every international investigation I see in the US, people are yelling about Chinese support for their domestic producers and low energy prices and low steel prices and all this kind of thing. Is that the sort of thing that we might expect a powerful or more powerful competition agency to be able to take on? Thank you.
Right. I mean, these are wonderful questions, and obviously, when China wanted to adopt the anti-monopoly law, you know, in 2007, before then there have been a long debate about whether China need an antitrust law at all, and it took almost 14 years for China to pass this law, where an authoritarian government can do it in a split second, right? I mean, and what has been holding back is precisely because China's huge state sector, which had lobbied against this law. But interestingly, as you pointed out, I mean, one of the major driving force to have this law is actually China's desire to have a single market, that it wants to eradicate all these barriers between different provinces and trying to remove local protectionisms, you know, in addition to other goals, of course. And that's why we have one special chapter that's very unique in Chinese antitrust law, dedicated to deal with administrative monopolies in China. But, you know, the law has been enforced for 12 years, and there have hardly been any substantial cases that deal with administrative monopoly. There have been a handful, but, you know, it's not as much as we have expected. And to a large extent, it's because the enforcement of this area is really lacks teeth, right? I mean, the authority cannot just go directly to fine another government agency for failing to comply with antitrust law. And it can only nudge these agencies, right? I mean, it can fine the companies, but for the most part, you know, this kind of enforcement relies on the local authorities, and you can imagine the kind of resistance and the constraints the local authorities face in dealing with those cases. And similarly, you know, antitrust have been applied to state-owned firms in China as well. And one of the former antitrust agency, NDRC, have take a very bold case against China Telecom and China Unicom back in 2011. The motivation behind, you know, this case is quite complex, but for the most part, I mean, NDRC also have some regulatory function in telecom pricing, and that might be one of the reasons why they go after these companies. Eventually, this case resulted in a suspension, and there was no penalty, right? I mean, ever since then, there haven't been any case against large state-owned firms in China, and there have been a recent wave of consolidation among large Chinese state-owned firms, and there have been hardly any enforcement. All these cases receive clearance from the Chinese antitrust authority, right? I mean, so, you know, there have been good explorations to enforce the law, to trying to restructure the market, trying to remove local protectionisms, and trying to, you know, discipline state-owned firms. But it appears to me that, you know, the existing institutional constraints that these agencies have faced have made it extremely hard for them to achieve these goals. And at the end of the day, there is a fundamental difference between Chinese antitrust authority and those you observe in Western democracies. Chinese antitrust authority enjoy a much lower level of independence than those in the United States and Europe, right? I mean, so I often say that our authorities need to look up, because they need their first order is to answer to the top leadership, rather than looking down to help and protect consumers. And that's why you see how quickly they reacted to President Xi's call and the Beijing's call to rein in big tech, right? I mean, they are part of the whole Chinese bureaucratic machine to help answer for Beijing's address various policy needs of Beijing. So that explains the limits of Chinese antitrust law.
Thank you. I am going to make a few decisions on some questions. I want to know, Susan Finder asked the question, what about antitrust enforcement against monopoly SOEs? And you've just said something about that, Angela, but I want to pick up on that. And this is how I want to relate back to Russell's question. The Chinese antitrust law against administrative monopoly, you've just told us why it doesn't have teeth and it's so hard to enforce. And yet it's so modern and it's so important. And it's, in a way, for some of it on local protectionism, it's a combination between a commerce clause and antitrust, trying to contain actions that might be by a province that will keep out the, quote, foreign goods from another province, but also actions by administrative bodies within the Chinese bureaucracy that's simply imposing conditions that are totally anti-competitive, self-serving, and pro-privilege. Isn't that, even with all of your caveats, isn't that a point that the Western countries should be praising China for and supporting them on to go further on? It's controlling very anti-competitive, obviously anti-competitive state action. So a case of possible harmony, even though China's kind of unempowered at that point. Maybe don't answer that right now. I'll leave it as a rhetoric question because of other questions that we would like to get to if we can. What I'd like to do is I want to read a question which is very relevant by Fabiana Fang, and then to go to Ira Belkin, who also asked an interesting question. So Fabiana Fang is asking about China Inc. And it's very related to what we are talking about in terms of who is China and China's subsidies and cross subsidies and privileges of Chinese firms because of subsidies. Fabiana Fang asks, what should be the appropriate or feasible criteria in defining China Inc. when it comes to international investment? Is it possible to draw boundaries on government influence in Chinese mergers, considering the current power imbalance between the government and business in China? So,
I mean, this is a excellent.
How to define China Inc. And I also want to relate that back to things you have been saying, like what has been said about Huawei and Huawei's access to data, and also this looming question, should we, which comes up in all the high-tech cases, should we be really, the West be really worried about appropriation of data for surveillance? And is that one of the things China is all about, and how do we guard against it? So that's a lot of different questions, but the short answer.
No, these are actually very relevant questions and very closely related. And then that brings me back to the book. I mean, how China, why do I put two things next to each other? How China regulates and how China is regulated, because these are two closely interrelated. Because how China regulates, right? I mean, the tighter control that the Chinese government has over its own businesses will have a direct impact on how foreign government will view Chinese investment and trade, right? I mean, because the tighter control, if we think the Chinese companies really enjoy no independence from the state, they will just bow to the whatever demands that the government make over these companies, including data transfer, right? I mean, then, you know, it's very natural for foreign government to have this trust over these companies. I mean, that is the whole logic of Trump blocking TikTok and WeChat, right? I mean, so, but putting that aside, you know, how do we strategically deal with those cases, those acquisitions? But on the one hand, what I'm saying is like we should facilitate more cooperation, more integration between the two countries, because we want the United States to have more leverage over China, right? I mean, then you need to have more Chinese investment on your soil. But on the other hand, you do need to maintain this vigilance over the Chinese investment, that they don't become a Trojan horse, right? I mean, so I guess there must be techniques, technology in place that where you can, and the United States can closely monitor what these Chinese companies are doing. And I remember at one point, Huawei's, you know, the founder of Huawei, Ren Zhengfei, even offered to sell Huawei, some part of Huawei, and divest some part of Huawei's assets to a foreign company. But no one really pay attention. You know, that offer, you know, that proposal didn't get any traction. I mean, that it didn't go anywhere. But it seems like, you know, what Huawei was doing is trying to give hostage to other countries, right? I mean, because it's willing to part with the assets and let other countries to have control over these key assets. And I was just puzzled why other countries don't pick up on that offer. And there could be other more, you know, flexible regulatory tools to deal with Chinese investment. So it's definitely not an easy balance to strike. But simply banning Chinese investment outright is not going to solve the problem. On the contrary, what you see right now is China is going all means to, you know, trying to achieve technological self-sufficiency. And, you know, there's so much waste in China right now to, you know, fund all these semiconductor factories, and in every single province there are this competition. And, you know, it's a waste, but I think this kind of urgency from the Chinese government will eventually, you know, facilitate the government to achieve some sort of goal, even though it's even farther away. But at the same time, it makes China more inclusive as a country, more, you know, aggressive, more nationalistic, and more self-reliant. And I don't think that will, you know, be the best for China or for the United States as well. I think it will even get worse, right? I mean, it will backfire and it will harm the interests of the US, particularly those US operations in China.
Thank you. I am going to try to combine some of these questions. We only have about 3 minutes. I might only have 2 minutes to combine them and then ask Angela to say a word in closing. So Ira Belkin has asked whether the anti-monopoly law has paid off in what the business community abroad might have thought would have been to open up local markets. Have local, provincial, and regional monopolies been broken up, and do foreign companies have access? This actually also goes back to Russell Pittman's question about use of the anti-monopoly law to make inroads into local restraints. And I'm skipping around and just putting some questions on the table, some of which you're not going to be able to answer, but very interesting from Nicholas Groffman: are decisions on antitrust likely to be made within the party structure, which includes industry bosses within its ranks? And that's true on the SOEs, who are the industry bosses. rather than just within government structures. And Abhishek Yadav, do you think the Chinese regulators' order against Alibaba was peculiar in the sense that not just slapped a high penalty, but proposed some structural changes similar to EU and UK regime? Do you see such a hybrid approach being adopted by the Chinese antitrust regulator? And here I just want to pause and say, is big tech area with guidelines, possible world notional standards achievable in big tech now that almost all the countries in the world, including China, are en route to trying to contain the power of big tech? I do have to stop there. I've taken up a lot of these great questions. I actually, Angela, because we only have a minute and a half, let's say I just put those questions out on the table, and you don't have to address any one or two in particular, because we just want to hear from you 1 or 2 minutes of closing comments, taking on whatever themes you think are most important.
Right. I mean, these are excellent questions, and if I can address a couple of them. And in the particular Alibaba case, the government right now only imposed a fine, but and hasn't request any divestiture, because under Chinese law, actually, they have no legal basis to ask a firm to divest its assets for abuse of dominance. But you're absolutely right. There have been rumors in the Wall Street Journal that Alibaba may be required to divest some of its media assets, including its holding in South China Morning Post and Sina Weibo. And I would not be surprised that the firm, even if it's not required under the law to do such things, it might volunteer to do so anyway, if that's what the government wants, right? I mean, so it might happen, and you will see the Chinese government appears to be much more, aggressive and much more efficient in that sense. I mean, lightning speed in reining in its big tech and driving them in the direction it wants. But at the same time, this kind of very volatile, aggressive enforcement campaign also put off foreign investors in Chinese tech, right? I mean, and they will, and that might discourage the investment in some areas, even though supposedly this kind of regulatory action is supposed to facilitate and help more competition, right? I mean, this should be good news overall for Chinese tech industry, but at the same time, it comes with a great cost, right? And precisely, we don't have this strong institutional support for regulation in China, and that goes back to the overall theme for this book, right? I mean, we realized, at the outset when I started researching on this topic, I have no idea what bureaucratic politics is in China. And for all this time, we are emphasizing on Chinese exceptionalism. And China is precisely exceptional in the sense that we don't have this kind of Western style of rule of law. We don't have the Western style of checks and balance. And instead, things are internalized within the bureaucracy. And that makes it very difficult for outsiders to understand what's happening in China. But at the same time, what I want to emphasize is that doesn't necessarily mean that companies cannot thrive in the Chinese market. Companies like Alibaba and Tencent, they were nurtured and grew up in the Chinese environment. They are well adapted to this kind of Chinese style of governance. So, and they're very good at seeking regulatory arbitrage within the bureaucracy. So I think the current episode, we have seen regarding China's regulation of big tech does not necessarily mean, the end of China's big tech or how they will suffer under the Chinese government's crackdown. I don't think that was China's intention, and it's more like China driving them towards a different direction.
Thank you. So Angela, this has been really spectacular. Thank you. Your book, for one thing, as everybody can tell from your talk, gives huge amounts of information to people that they ought to have about how the bureaucracy works. And with that information, we can move ahead. I think we'd all love to see a little essay from you about what are the best steps each side can take, China and outside China, to move the dialogue ahead towards greater harmony. Thank you very, very much. And thank all of you who participated and for your wonderful participation and questions.
Thank you, Eleanor. It was a great pleasure to be here. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you. Okay, bye-bye.